Hey everyone, before this story unfolds, let me pull you into a moment that changed the direction of an entire life. This is not just a story about abandonment. This is a story about truth buried under silence, power hidden beneath pain, and a black queen who rose long before she understood her crown. If stories of resilience, revenge without violence, and destiny delayed but never denied speak to your spirit, take a second to like this story, subscribe to the channel, and become part of a community that honors strength in its rawest form. Welcome to Black Queen Dominion, where forgotten girls become unforgettable women. This story begins with absence. Not the loud kind. Not the dramatic kind that arrives with slammed doors and shouted goodbyes. This absence arrived quietly, like fog creeping under a door, unnoticed until everything was cold. I was a child shaped by routine, by the predictable rhythm of school mornings and evenings that smelled faintly of overcooked rice and detergent. My world was small, contained within walls that were never warm but always familiar. My father was a shadow stretched thin by work and exhaustion, present in body but distant in spirit. And then there was her, my stepmother, who occupied space without ever truly entering my life. She had entered our home after my mother's death, carrying order and control instead of comfort. She managed the house like a business, not a family. Affection was inefficient, unnecessary. I learned early how to become small, how to move quietly, how to anticipate moods and avoid becoming a problem. Childhood became a lesson in invisibility. The day everything broke did not announce itself as tragedy. There was no storm, no argument, no warning signs screaming danger. It was an ordinary morning. My school uniform was folded neatly, my shoes by the door. Breakfast sat untouched because no one noticed whether I ate or not. My father had already left. The house felt hollow, like it was holding its breath. By afternoon I was no longer part of the plan. I was told, without emotion, without explanation, that I would not be staying. There was no tenderness in the decision, no attempt to soften the blow. It was framed as necessity, as inconvenience resolved. A bag was packed with efficiency, containing clothes that no longer felt like mine. I was guided out, not pushed, not dragged, simply removed. Children understand more than adults realize, and in that moment I understood one thing clearly. I was disposable. The place I was taken to was not a refuge. It was a temporary solution disguised as care. A distant relative, unfamiliar faces, unfamiliar rules. I became the child people whispered about, the one with the complicated story no one wanted to explain. Questions followed me everywhere, but answers never came. I learned to stop asking. Years passed, measured not by birthdays but by survival. Each year layered resilience over hurt, ambition over abandonment. I learned to rely on myself in ways no child should have to. School became my escape, not because it was kind but because it was predictable. Books replaced lullabies. Goals replaced dreams. I built a future brick by brick, using discipline instead of hope. The absence of my stepmother became a scar that never fully healed, but it also became fuel. I refused to become what she saw when she looked at me and decided I was no longer worth keeping. I worked harder, pushed further, demanded more from myself than anyone else ever had. Somewhere along the way, survival transformed into success. By the time adulthood arrived, I had built a life that looked impressive from the outside. Education earned without guidance. Stability created without support. Respect gained without inheritance. I wore independence like armor, polished and heavy. I told myself that the past no longer mattered, that abandonment was a closed chapter, a finished lesson. But the past has a way of waiting. It waits until you are strong enough to face it. Until the truth can no longer destroy you, only redefine you. The message arrived unexpectedly, slipping into my life like a ghost with unfinished business. It was not emotional. It was not dramatic. It was factual, brief, and devastating in its implications. Information surfaced that did not align with the story I had been given. Details that suggested my abandonment was not a simple act of rejection but part of something far more deliberate. For the first time, the ground beneath my carefully built world shifted. Questions I had buried began to surface, heavy and insistent. Why had it happened so easily? Why had no one looked for me? Why had the silence lasted so long? The narrative I had accepted for years began to crack, revealing fractures filled with secrets. The woman who abandoned me was no longer just a symbol of cruelty. She was becoming a mystery. And mysteries demand answers. As I stood on the edge of this revelation, torn between the comfort of ignorance and the danger of truth, one thing became clear. My life had not unfolded by accident. Forces beyond my understanding had shaped my path, redirected my future, and hidden my identity in plain sight. The truth was approaching, slow but inevitable. And when it arrived, it would change everything. The truth rarely arrives all at once. It comes in fragments, like scattered pieces of a mirror that once reflected a life you were never allowed to see clearly. After the message surfaced, after the first crack split the story I had lived with for years, silence returned, but this time it was different. This silence was heavy, deliberate, and filled with intention. It was the kind of quiet that meant something had been hidden on purpose. I moved through my days with a sharpened awareness. Everything I once accepted without question now felt suspicious. Memories resurfaced, small details that had seemed insignificant before but now pulsed with meaning. The way documents were always kept out of my reach. The way my stepmother avoided certain names, certain places. The way my father's face tightened whenever the past edged too close to conversation. These were not coincidences. They were choices. I began retracing my history not emotionally but methodically. I approached my past the way I had approached survival, with discipline, patience, and resolve. Records replaced recollections. Dates replaced feelings. I requested files, dug through archives, and followed trails that others assumed had gone cold long ago. Every piece of information felt like it was testing me, asking whether I was ready to see what had been deliberately concealed. What I uncovered first was not shocking. It was unsettling in a quieter way. The timeline of my abandonment did not align with the explanation I had been given. There were gaps, weeks unaccounted for, addresses that didn't match, guardianship papers signed too easily. The system had accepted my disappearance with alarming efficiency. I had not been lost. I had been placed. Positioned, removed from one life and inserted into another with signatures and stamps that carried authority but no truth. The realization settled into me slowly, like a storm forming on the horizon. This was not neglect. This was strategy. My stepmother had not simply walked away from responsibility. She had orchestrated my erasure. The deeper I searched, the more resistance I encountered. Files that should have been accessible were suddenly missing. Clerks grew hesitant, their voices cautious. Doors that had seemed open quietly closed. It became clear that someone had invested time and effort into ensuring the story stayed buried. That investment meant one thing: the truth had value. And value always threatens power. I started to understand that my life had been redirected not because I was unwanted, but because I was inconvenient. Something about my existence disrupted a plan, complicated an image, threatened an outcome someone else desired. I was not discarded. I was removed from the board. That distinction changed everything. Anger arrived, not explosive but controlled, refined by years of restraint. It did not consume me, it focused me. I was no longer searching for closure. I was searching for clarity. Every step forward felt like reclaiming territory that had been stolen from me without my consent. As the investigation continued, one name began to surface repeatedly. Not loudly, not boldly, but persistently. It appeared in property records, legal documents, and financial statements connected to my father's life during the years I had been gone. That name was tied to stability, influence, and resources far beyond what I had known. The life I had struggled to build from nothing existed parallel to another life I had never been allowed to access. The implication was staggering. My absence had created space. Space for inheritance to shift. Space for narratives to be rewritten. Space for someone else's future to solidify while mine was left to chance. My stepmother had not just removed a child. She had redirected a legacy. Understanding that truth required me to confront something even heavier: my father's role. Whether through weakness, manipulation, or fear, he had allowed it to happen. Silence, I learned, can be as powerful as action. His absence from my search spoke louder than any confession. Yet even that betrayal did not break me. By then I had already survived worse. Each discovery sharpened my identity rather than fracturing it. I was no longer the abandoned child wondering why she wasn't enough. I was a woman uncovering how much she had been worth all along. The resilience I had built in isolation now became my greatest weapon. I had learned to move without permission, to succeed without validation, to rise without support. Those skills were not accidents. They were preparation. There were moments when the weight of it all pressed heavily on my chest. Nights when the injustice felt too large, too deliberate, too cruel. But even in those moments, I refused to collapse into bitterness. I understood something my stepmother never had. Power does not come from controlling others. It comes from mastering yourself. The closer I got to the truth, the more obvious it became that confrontation was inevitable. Not loud confrontation. Not dramatic exposure. Something far more effective. Knowledge was shifting the balance. The narrative was no longer theirs to control. The woman who had abandoned me believed the past was sealed. She believed time had protected her. She believed silence was permanent. He was wrong. Because silence only works when the forgotten stay forgotten. And I was done being invisible. The truth was no longer a distant concept. It was forming a shape, a structure, a reality that would soon demand acknowledgement. My life, my identity, my removal, it was all connected to a decision that had benefited others at my expense. But the greatest revelation had yet to surface. What I was about to learn would not just explain my abandonment. It would redefine who I was meant to be. By the time the third layer of truth began to reveal itself, I no longer approached discovery with innocence. I approached it with strategy. I had learned that answers do not respond to emotion. They respond to persistence. Each document I touched, each record I traced, carried the weight of intention. Someone had planned my disappearance with care, and care always leaves patterns. The name that had surfaced earlier refused to stay quiet. It followed me through databases and registries like a shadow that knew it would eventually be seen. This name was not just connected to my father's past. It was embedded in the structure of influence that surrounded his life. Businesses, properties, investments. An entire ecosystem of wealth and leverage existed just outside the version of reality I had been forced to accept. The realization was not immediate, but when it landed heavily. My childhood had been erased at the precise moment when my presence would have complicated ownership, inheritance, and control. I had been removed not because I was a burden, but because I was a threat. A living variable in an equation someone else wanted to solve without resistance. My stepmother's actions were not impulsive. They were calculated. This was no longer just a personal story. It was a structural one. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that my father had once stood at the edge of a very different future. There were plans drafted in his name, ventures discussed, paths that could have altered everything. But those plans required stability, unity, and a family image that did not include complications. I was the complication that could not be managed, only removed. Understanding this reframed every memory I had ever had of my stepmother. Her coldness was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was fear. Fear of disruption. Fear of loss. Fear that my existence could undo the future she was building for herself. She had not seen a child. She had seen a risk. And risks in her world were eliminated. What struck me most was not the scale of what I had lost, but the precision with which it had been taken. Systems had been leveraged. People had been persuaded. Paperwork had been executed flawlessly. This was not the act of one woman acting alone. This was collaboration enabled by silence. Yet despite the complexity of the scheme, there was one fatal flaw. They assumed I would never come back looking. As the picture grew clearer, so did my sense of self. I stopped seeing my resilience as compensation for loss and began seeing it as inheritance in its own right. Everything I had built on my own, my education, my independence, my voice, was proof that removal had not diminished me. It had sharpened me. There was a moment late into one night of research when the final confirmation surfaced. A document I was never meant to see, archived but not destroyed. It outlined contingencies, succession plans, and conditions tied directly to lineage. My name was not written in full, but it was referenced indirectly, carefully, like something dangerous. A clause that required absence for continuity. That was the moment the truth fully crystallized. My abandonment had secured someone else's future. And my survival had disrupted their certainty. The emotional impact was complex, layered, and deeply controlled. I did not collapse. I did not rage. I sat with the knowledge and allowed it to settle into something solid. Understanding brings responsibility. Power requires restraint. I knew that whatever came next had to be deliberate. I was no longer chasing answers. I was holding them. The question shifted from what happened to what I would do with the truth. Revenge, as I had learned, does not always wear the face of destruction. Sometimes it looks like exposure. Sometimes it looks like reclamation. Sometimes it looks like standing exactly where you were never meant to stand and refusing to move. The woman who had erased me had built her life on the assumption that the past was compliant. That secret stayed buried. That children removed became adults silenced. She underestimated time. Because time had done something extraordinary. It had transformed a discarded child into a woman capable of dismantling narratives with precision. I did not need to confront her directly. The truth itself was confrontation enough. Plans began forming, not impulsively but intentionally. I began positioning myself in spaces connected to the legacy I had been denied. I did not announce my presence. I allowed it to be discovered. Influence responds to subtlety. Power shifts quietly before it becomes visible. Every step forward felt like alignment rather than rebellion. I was not forcing myself into a place I did not belong. I was returning to one that had been stolen from me. The confidence that came with that understanding was unshakable. The final phase would require patience. There were still pieces missing, still alliances to navigate, still consequences to consider. But the foundation was set. I knew who I was. I knew what had been taken. And I knew that the truth, once revealed fully, would not just correct the past. It would rewrite the future. The woman who abandoned me had built her security on my absence. Soon she would have to face my presence. By the time I stepped into the world that had once been close to me, I did not arrive as a question. I arrived as a certainty. The shift had already begun long before my name was spoken aloud in spaces it had been deliberately excluded from. Influence had a way of recognizing its own, even when history tried to deny it. I moved carefully, not out of fear but out of respect for timing. Power does not rush. It observes. I allowed my achievements to speak first, detached from the story that had shaped them. Credentials earned independently. Success built without sponsorship. A reputation forged where my past held no leverage over my present. People listened not because of where I came from but because of what I had done. And yet, the connections were impossible to ignore. The same circles that had once benefited from my absence now found themselves intrigued by my presence. Familiar names crossed my path, some with recognition they could not quite place, others with discomfort they could not explain. The past was beginning to ripple through the present, subtle but undeniable. What they saw was not a broken remnant of a discarded childhood. What they encountered was a woman fully formed, grounded, and unafraid. The contrast unsettled them. It disrupted the narrative they had relied on for years. They expected fragility. They found authority. The woman who had abandoned me sensed the shift before she saw me. People like her always do. They are attuned to changes that threaten the structures they depend on. Invitations slowed. Whispers grew. Questions surfaced that had no easy answers. She had built her life on control and control was slipping. When our paths finally crossed, it was not dramatic. Did not need to be. The moment carried weight because of what it represented, not how it appeared. Time had done its work. I stood there not seeking recognition, not demanding explanation, simply existing in a space I had been denied. My presence was the revelation. She saw it immediately. The resemblance not just in features but in composure. The confidence that does not ask permission. The strength that does not announce itself. Her reaction confirmed everything I already knew. Fear flickered, quickly masked by practiced restraint. The past had come back not as a memory but as reality. I did not confront her with accusations. I did not demand apologies. Those things belong to people seeking validation from those who never intended to give it. I had already outgrown that need. My power came from something far more destabilizing. Truth without hostility. The systems that had protected her began to shift under the weight of exposure. Quiet inquiries turned into formal reviews. Documents once ignored gained new relevance. People who had benefited from silence began to distance themselves from it. Loyalty, I learned, is often conditional. My father's role, long shrouded in absence, surfaced through the cracks. His silence, once impenetrable, now appeared less like indifference and more like complicity softened by regret. Yet regret does not undo harm. It only acknowledges it too late. I did not seek reconciliation. I sought resolution. Each step forward reclaimed more than opportunity. It reclaimed narrative. The story of my life was no longer something others could define for me. I was no longer the child who vanished. I was the woman who returned, not to disrupt for the sake of chaos, but to restore balance. There is a particular kind of justice that arrives not with punishment, but with inevitability. The kind that unfolds when truth is allowed to stand in full view. When lies lose their utility. When control erodes under the weight of accountability. That was the justice I embodied. The woman who had abandoned me did not lose everything overnight. Life rarely works that way. But she lost certainty. She lost narrative dominance. She lost the comfort of believing the past was safely buried. In its place, she gained something far more unsettling. The knowledge that the child she erased had become the woman who could not be ignored. And I felt no triumph in that realization. Only clarity. Because this was never about revenge in the way the world often imagines it. This was about restoration. About reclaiming what had been taken and refusing to carry the shame that never belonged to me. My existence, my success, my presence, they were not acts of defiance. They were acts of truth. As the dust began to settle, one final question remained unanswered. What would I do with the legacy that had been denied to me? Would I step fully into it, claim what was rightfully mine, and reshape the future that had been built without me? Or would I walk away, having proven what needed no further demonstration? The answer was already forming. Because queens do not return to the throne to destroy it. They return to redefine it. The final chapter of this story did not begin with confrontation, victory, or collapse. It began with choice. The kind of choice only someone who has survived erasure can make. Standing at the intersection of past and future, I understood that reclaiming what was taken did not require becoming what had tried to erase me. Power had been presented to me in many forms throughout my life. First as absence. Then as endurance. Later as knowledge. And now, finally, as authority. The difference was that this authority did not come from inheritance alone. It came from experience, earned and unfiltered. I chose to step fully into the legacy that had been denied to me, but on my own terms. Not to replicate the structures that had excluded me, but to transform them. The same systems that once made my disappearance possible would now have to answer to my presence. Transparency replaced secrecy. Accountability replaced convenience. The quiet efficiency with which I moved unsettled those who had relied on silence for security. The transition was not loud. It did not make headlines. It didn't need to. Influence reshapes reality long before it attracts attention. I became involved where decisions were made, not where stories were told. My voice carried weight not because of what had been done to me, but because of what I could now do for others. The woman who had abandoned me faded into irrelevance not through punishment, but through obsolescence. Her strategies no longer worked in a world that no longer needed them. Control loses its grip when truth becomes the standard. She was not defeated by my anger. He was undone by my evolution. As for my father, his silence finally broke, but it arrived too late to matter. I listened not to validate his regrets, but to understand the final pieces of the story. Understanding is not forgiveness. It is closure. And closure does not require reconciliation. What mattered most was not what I reclaimed materially, but what I restored internally. I reclaimed my name not as a legal formality, but as an identity fully owned. I reclaimed my narrative, no longer fractured by half-truths and omissions. I reclaimed the child who had once been told, without words, that she did not belong. She belonged all along. The irony was unmistakable. The years of struggle, isolation, and self-reliance that were meant to diminish me had instead refined me. I entered this restored legacy not as someone seeking approval, but as someone capable of leadership. My perspective was broader because it had been forged outside privilege. My compassion deeper because it had been earned in survival. That was the power they never anticipated. I used my position not to erase others, but to ensure no one else could be erased so easily. Policies changed. Pathways opened. Stories that once would have been silenced were now amplified. My presence became proof that removal does not erase destiny. It only delays it. Looking back, I understood something profound. My stepmother did not create my strength by abandoning me. But her attempt to control my future revealed a truth she could never escape. Destiny does not require permission. It only requires endurance. This was never just a story about betrayal. It was a story about reclamation. About the long arc of justice that bends not through force but through persistence. About a Black woman who was pushed out of her own life and returned not with vengeance, but with vision. And that is the most powerful ending of all. Because when the truth finally surfaced, it did not destroy me, crown me,